Britain's major galleries house some of the finest collections of art to be found anywhere in the world.
But there are thousands of other artworks we know little about in the collections of smaller institutions. Over 80% of this publicly owned treasure is in storage and often uncatalogued. We don't know the name of the artist, the subject, or when and where they were painted.
The Art UK website was created to shine a light into these shadows and now has over 200,000 paintings online. Using this database, we'll be traveling the country, seeking out potential lost masterpieces.
When we find an interesting painting, I'll investigate the story behind its creation, using a meticulous process of restoration, research, and scientific analysis.
I'll be exploring the world in which these works were created.
The social and historical background to the life of the artist that gives a picture its context.
But simply finding a painting is just the beginning of the trail.
Glasgow Museum's Resource Centre is a treasure chest of the city's history and includes an outstanding art collection. We're here to investigate a mysterious portrait, which I hope will turn out to be by one of Britain's most important painters.
The painting was bequeathed to Glasgow by a wealthy coach builder whose personal art collection was the rock on which the city's galleries were built.
Isn't she wonderful?
The picture will present unique challenges, and the science is going to be absolutely key to our attempt to work out who painted it.
The portrait is thought to show one of the most famous women of her age. Talented and beautiful, I'll be tracing her tragically short life.
The Resource Centre painting store is just the sort of place to uncover a lost masterpiece. Guiding me through this labyrinth is curator Joanna Meacock.
3,000 pictures in here.
I've been browsing the collection on the Art UK website, and there's a portrait that I hope will provide us with a rich story to unpack.
It's just on this rack here.
The painting has my favourite attribution, artist unknown, but it has all the hallmarks of the work of our first truly great British painter, Sir Joshua Reynolds.
Well, what a tantalising painting. It's described as a portrait of Elizabeth Linley, and I don't know a great deal about her, but she was clearly a woman of some status. It's actually an unfinished picture. It's a study, and I'm always a sucker for an unfinished painting, because I think you get a much purer distillation of artistic skill, especially in a portrait. It's what the artist wants you to see rather than what the sitter wants you to see, so you don't get bogged down in things like jewellery or the details of someone's latest fashion. Sometimes, when we see a really great Reynolds portrait, we have an idea not just of what someone looked like, but what they were thinking as well. The question is, have we got that here? It's too early to tell at this stage. I'm quite optimistic and rather excited.
Sir Joshua Reynolds is one of those artists who shows us just what paint can do. A simple dab of colour, a quick flick of his brush, and a convincing detail brings the sitter to life. He had an ability to capture the essence of his subject. He painted characters rather than caricatures. As first president of the Royal Academy, he did so much to establish a new respect for British art, not just at home, but internationally. I think this portrait has exactly the accomplished technique we're looking for. But was it painted by Joshua Reynolds? And who was Elizabeth Linley?
From the 1850s onwards, the good folk of Glasgow were fortunate to be able to see some very impressive works of art owned by the city council. and I was curious to know how Glasgow got a head start in the era of municipal art galleries. Strangely, the origins lie in the city's investment in its roads, as their benefactor was a coach and carriage builder.
The painting that Bendor has chosen is one of many donated in the 19th century by an upstanding Glasgow citizen named Archibald McLellan. McLellan was building coaches at a time when Glasgow's roads improved dramatically, and he became a very wealthy man.
When he died, he left over 400 paintings to the city, including the portrait of Elizabeth Linley. In an instant, the people of Glasgow found themselves with one of the greatest art collections in the British Isles. Archibald was born in 1797 at a time when the port of Glasgow was expanding rapidly, driven by a new mercantile class.
The wealth these merchants generated resulted in a building boom for the city. And this in turn brought investment in new industries and, crucially for Archibald McLellan, in new infrastructure.
Improvements in the roads increased demand for the transport that used them, and the McLellan coach building business thrived. The family could afford to pay for young Archibald to receive a liberal education at Glasgow University, and at some point he developed a serious passion for art. Glasgow's magnificent Kelvingrove Gallery is now home to many of the paintings from his collection, including a fine portrait of Archibald himself.
One of my favourite genres of British art is portraits of Victorian men looking pleased with themselves. And we have a great example here. Check out the size of Archibald McLellan's throne. McLellan had every reason to feel pleased with himself, of course. He was a wealthy businessman, but also a noted philanthropist, typical of the Victorian kind, who believed it was the duty of the rich to support the less fortunate.
McLellan wanted his collection to feature good examples of paintings from the broad sweep of art history, the better to educate Glasgow's citizens. He was very proud of this Titian.
The imperial wealth that made Glasgow one of the richest cities in Europe has gone, but fortunately for us, the art has remained. This is one of the jewels in the crown of Glasgow Museum's collection.
The Victorians regarded a good Titian as an essential part of a serious collection, and this one cost McLellan £250.
But if you thought this was a bargain, wait till you see what McLellan bought for £4. An Annunciation by Botticelli. Now, when McLellan bought this, Botticelli wasn't the major name that he is today. He'd yet to be rediscovered. It's absolutely sublime, and it shows Botticelli's mastery of perspective, and look at the sensitivity of the Madonna here. I think this tells us that McLellan had a very good eye when it came to collecting great masterpieces. Now, if McLellan bought this for £4, he must have been really sure of our possible Reynolds, which had sold for more than £80. Well, it's our job to see if he'd made a sound investment.
Glasgow museums have agreed that their possible Joshua Reynolds painting can make the journey to the studio of our picture restorer, Simon Gillespie, where we can start to get under its skin.
This is a fabulous piece of mahogany. That's one plank. It's in lovely condition. Look how flat it is as well. It's a really beautiful piece of work.
Now, talking of beauty.
And look at that, isn't she wonderful?
Yes. Joshua Reynolds?
Yeah.
At the sound of Reynolds' name, Simon seemed to lose some of his enthusiasm.
Well, the problem with Reynolds is his inconsistency of materials. He experimented not only with oil, but he'd also mix in something like wax. Wax is a nice thing to paint with, and it was a very fashionable thing at that time, but it's a thing that is very soluble. We use solvents to clean the varnish off, which would also then attack the paint slab, which has got wax in it.
All right.
And it would probably mean we can't clean it. So we need to do some tests, some scientific tests to analyze what materials he's used.
Seems I may have dropped a bit of a clanger in choosing Miss Linley. On the easel, it's clear there's something else odd about the picture. The composition seems wrong.
Is that a column?
It's very curious.
And then there's another sort of
A ledge.
edge at the bottom with no paint on at all.
It doesn't make sense, does it? So what's going on, do you think? Do you think he was intending to reduce the size of the picture?
Maybe, yes, because then she would be in the middle, wouldn't she?
The head would then be in the middle of that area. Or is he, in fact, still designing the painting? Is this a sketch for a bigger painting?
It's one of many questions to answer about this painting.
We are in the hands of the scientists to tell us what we can do next.
To kick off the scientific investigations, X-ray and infrared scans of the paintings are made. These will tell us if the artist made any significant changes to the painting during its creation. While we wait for the results, I'm going to see what I can find out about the subject of the portrait. Whoever painted our picture, there never seems to have been any doubt about who the sitter was. Elizabeth Linley. Looking back through the provenance of the painting, the history of its ownership and its sales records, we can trace it back to a sale in the 1830s when it was already listed as Elizabeth Linley. This would have only been 40 years after her death, so close enough to be within living memory. She was a celebrated beauty, and there are several other portraits of her to compare. Gainsborough painted her several times and gave her a wistful beauty. I also came across this article about Elizabeth that was published in the Illustrated London News in 1911. Glasgow's portrait is included as one of the many depictions of her. The verdict is not completely unanimous, however. In the Resource Centre files, there's a letter written in 1897 from Elizabeth's descendant, the Marquess of Dufferin and Ava, who wrote to say that he had doubts that the picture was of Miss Linley. As in other portraits, her nose is perfectly straight, whereas in the Glasgow picture, it is decidedly retroussé, which is a French word meaning it turns up at the end. If we can clean the painting, it may reveal facial features that have become obscured by dirt and overpaint so that the comparison may become clearer. But it looks like there's enough evidence to support the idea that this is Elizabeth. I think it's time that we take a closer look at the remarkable story of this extraordinary woman. Elizabeth Linley was born in Bath in 1754. She only lived to be 37, but she crammed a great deal into her short life. She was the first of two daughters of Thomas Linley, a musician and music teacher who trained them rigorously. Their home was nicknamed the Nest of Nightingales. When her father became musical director of the most fashionable venue in Bath, the New Assembly Rooms, Elizabeth became a star turn, despite being only 9 years old. So would it have been frowned upon to have a 9-year-old out at night performing in front of large audiences?
Not particularly for musician families. Certainly in Bath, you would put your children on the stage as soon as they were really able to do it. Is that exploitation? Well, we would think of it probably today, but I don't think in the 18th century necessarily they did. It was a means for the family to increase their income. It's Elizabeth who's the outstanding performer. She's the hot ticket in town.
And did Elizabeth make much money from her career?
She was very successful financially. The Bath Chronicle reckoned that by 1773, she alone had made about £10,000. Certainly the father would ask for 200 guineas per performance. And remember, none of that money goes to her. It all goes to the father, because he had apprenticed her to him, and under the apprenticeship system, the master gets all the money. And she was literally, well, enslaved financially to her father.
It's making me think maybe things haven't changed that much.
£10,000 is over £1 million in today's money and enabled the family to move into a house in Royal Crescent. There was a less positive side to Elizabeth's success, however. As she grew older, her beauty and celebrity status drew a great deal of unwanted attention from men.
She had a lot of suitors interested in her. There was an offer of marriage from an elderly gentleman who was prepared to pay a lot of money for her, but was eventually persuaded to retract. And then there were the attentions of this dreadful man, Captain Matthews, who pestered her continually. And Thomas Linley Sr., the father, seemed to do nothing about this.
Elizabeth confided in a close friend, Alicia Sheridan, whose brother Richard agreed to chaperone her on her walk home to keep Captain Matthews and his ilk away. Almost inevitably, Sheridan too fell under her spell, and the couple began a relationship. But he was penniless, with no prospects or income, and there was little chance that either family would agree to the match. Eventually, the couple eloped to France and got married.
When they returned to Britain, their foreign marriage wasn't recognised, and the lovers were separated by their disapproving families. And here in Bath, Elizabeth returned to the stage. Her father, Thomas Linley, was fearful for the loss of his star performer, as she was still earning him a formidable income. But the couple kept in touch, secretly leaving each other love letters at a grotto here by the river.
Elizabeth held on to the prospect of a life with Sheridan for 2 years, but then gave up hope. She asked him to return her letters to preserve her future marriage prospects.
The threat of losing her altogether finally spurred Sheridan into action. Defying their parents' wishes, the couple fled to London, where they were officially married. But did they live happily ever after? Sadly not.
At Simon's studio, paint analyst Nick Eastor has come to take some samples from the portrait to see if wax might have been used in its creation.
We're trying to work out what the original binding medium of the paint was. So we want a representative sample of the original material. Also, we don't want to take samples from areas where it's going to be very obvious. In this instance, what we've been able to find is a small damage on the face, so we're going to take advantage of that.
The glassy surface of the portrait suggests it's in good condition, but the varnish has discoloured and darkened from age, and we need to remove it to stand any chance of a new attribution. But if wax is present, we risk damaging the original paint, as the solvents used to remove the varnish will also dissolve the wax. The varnish itself could be a problem for Simon, as finding a solvent strong enough to remove it might also risk damaging the original paint layer. It'll be a tense wait for the results. Whether we can clean the portrait or not, the way it is painted with such economy and bravura brushwork make me confident it is the work of Joshua Reynolds, widely regarded as Britain's first truly great painter. Reynolds was from the West Country. He was born in 1723 and began his career in the naval town of Plymouth Dock, now known as Devonport. He was no country bumpkin, though. The naval base was the powerhouse of Britain's military might, where news of great events often arrived before it reached the capital. Reynolds' early commissions were naval officers from the local landowning families, where he learnt country house manners. He was apprenticed to a London portrait painter, and in this early self-portrait, he's shading his eyes as if staring into the distance at his own future. His confidence is clear, but it was his connection to the Royal Navy that was to launch his career. On the 11th of May 1749, HMS Centurion sailed out of Plymouth Dock for the Mediterranean on a mission to negotiate a peace treaty with the Barbary pirates. Captain Augustus Keppel had a civilian passenger on board, one Joshua Reynolds, hitching a ride to Italy. The pair became lifelong friends on this voyage, and Reynolds painted this portrait of Keppel during a winter layover in Minorca. His ability to give his subjects the heroic treatment was already evident. Keppel dropped Reynolds at Livorno in Italy. He arrived in Rome in the late spring of 1750. He was keen that this journey should not be regarded as a traditional grand tour. He was no aristocratic playboy come to gaze in awe, but a craftsman on a mission to investigate and observe, to make his own mind up about what Italy had to teach him. Unusually for a British painter visiting Rome, he didn't seek tuition in the studio of an Italian master. He wrote in his journal that they were mostly commonplace.
Most artists wanting to learn from past masters would studiously copy their works in oil, observing everything from the way they mixed their colours to the texture of their paint. But not Reynolds. Such copying was, he wrote, merely so much time lost. And after all, the mere technique of painting came as second nature to him. No, Reynolds was after something else. Because he wanted to radically change the way British artists thought about painting, he'd come to Italy looking for ideas. Instead of copying the mere touches of the great masters, he said, copy only their conceptions and possess yourself with their spirit.
Like all tourists, even grand ones, Reynolds was on the hunt for souvenirs. His sketchbooks give a fascinating glimpse into what he learnt in Italy and what impressed him. Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Teresa, sculptures in the Loggia dei Lanzi in Florence, the fountains and colonnades at St. Peter's.
Here's the Moses Fountain. And here is Reynolds' sketch of it. You can tell he was a man in a hurry just looking for ideas, a few quick lines, and then he's off to the next attraction.
In fact, Reynolds spent so long sketching in the streets of Rome that he caught a bad cold, which he blamed for affecting his hearing for the rest of his life. Occasionally, Reynolds would see something that struck him so powerfully, he determined to borrow it entirely for his own work. Not, as he said, to copy it, but to possess its spirit.
The standard repertoire of Renaissance and classical sculptures was well established in Reynolds' day, and it hasn't really changed much since. There's Michelangelo's David and the Venus de Milo. But the one that British visitors most wanted to take home with them was the Apollo Belvedere.
The Apollo Belvedere was a Roman statue discovered during the early years of the Renaissance. His bow has long since disappeared, but Apollo has just loosed an arrow, and the subtle yet flamboyant portrayal of movement was viewed as almost magical, bringing the marble to life. It captures the moment when his weight has just shifted from one foot to the other. The artistic term is contrapposto. Countless copies were made and sent back to Britain.
The Apollo Belvedere epitomized everything that had drawn Reynolds to Italy. It was elegant. It represented aesthetic perfection as well as ancient learning. Above all, it had a certain grandeur about it. And when Reynolds took this Italian spirit with him back to Britain, it became known as the Grand Manner. It not only changed the way the British were depicted in art, but also how they saw themselves.
When he got back to London, Reynolds painted a portrait that cunningly exploited Apollo mania and loudly announced the arrival of a new talent. Today, it's in the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. It's another picture of his friend, Augustus Keppel, and Reynolds has painted him in a contrapposto pose, just like the Apollo Belvedere.
Keppel shifts his weight effortlessly from one foot to the other. It allows him to stride through the picture plane elegantly, yet also commandingly. But more important, I think, was the visual reference to the Apollo Belvedere itself. In the 18th century, anybody looking at this picture would immediately have recognized the pose. And this was a time when the British aristocracy was obsessed with the Grand Tour and all things classical. They would often have themselves painted next to an object from the Grand Tour, like the Apollo Belvedere. But Joshua Reynolds could go one better and turn his sitters into those classical objects. The picture was wildly popular. In fact, this portrait was so important for Reynolds that he didn't give it to the sitter. He kept it in his studio for a few years as an advertisement for what he could do. This was a small step for a man, but a giant leap for painting.
While the portrait of Augustus Keppel is all about movement, our painting is calm and tranquil by comparison. But Reynolds' ability to capture the mood of his subjects is just as acute. Elizabeth has a pensive, thoughtful look, as well she might. After an idyllic honeymoon in a secluded country cottage, Elizabeth and Richard returned to London. But their married life soon became challenging.
The key to their turbulent relationship seems to revolve around the penniless Sheridan's insistence that he was a gentleman and as such should live and behave like one. This was a key social distinction in Georgian Britain. However, keeping up appearances could be expensive.
Richard had ambitions. He took a house in Orchard Street, then, as now, a very exclusive part of town that was far beyond their means. He had married a beautiful, famous, and widely admired performer, whose every move was reported in the press, someone we would now call a celebrity. But Sheridan was soon heavily in debt, and Elizabeth must have wondered if it was all a terrible mistake.
Like many women of her time, Eliza loved her husband, but she came to understand that she had left the absolute control of one man, her father, for that of another, her husband. What kind of man was Sheridan?
He's a jerk, I think.
That's what I was getting at.
I think that's probably true. I think he's charming. He's intelligent. He's witty, ambitious.
Could they be seen as, you know, kind of a 18th century it couple?
Yeah, they're quite trendy, but they're also on the edge. They're on the margin. They don't actually have the money and the status. What's interesting about that period is that we've got a really active press, and that's both positive and negative, but it means that images like the engravings and prints of her picture would have been sold in print shops around the country.
Ooh, so kind of like the gossip magazines of the time.
Oh, yes. We've got things like the Town and Country magazine, which prints all kinds of scandal, usually with the names of the individuals conveniently given with a capital letter and then a blank line, but everybody knew who it was. So, yeah, there's definitely that.
What is her marriage to Sheridan like?
Her marriage to Sheridan starts out really good, and the comments are that they seem to be madly in love with each other. But by 1775, already Sheridan's having his first affair.
And how are they earning their income? What's Eliza doing?
He's really adamant that although she's famous as a singer, everybody knows her as a singer, that she isn't going to perform for money on the stage as his wife. So consequently, she performs in what we would call private society, but it isn't really very private because it's the elite society of the day, the kind of society that had concerts at homes. And so it's everybody who is anybody. This is the it world.
Salvation for the couple came with a complete change of direction. With probably considerable but uncredited help from Eliza, Sheridan wrote a play, The Rivals, a witty comedy of manners set in Bath. The play opened at the Covent Garden Theatre, now the Royal Opera House. Unfortunately, the audience hated it and loudly protested. It seemed like its first performance would be its last.
Amazingly, Sheridan rewrote the play in a few days, and it opened here later that month. The revised version was a runaway success and went on to become a firm favourite of the King, George III, and across the Atlantic, of George Washington.
The couple spent the summer together writing a follow-up, The Duenna, a comic opera with music by Elizabeth's brother Tom. This was also a huge box office hit, and the Sheridans yet again became the talk of the town.
This dramatic success rather went to Richard's head. He bought a share of the Drury Lane Theatre and became the manager. However, despite the best efforts of Eliza to support the venture, it was a disaster.
The theatre burnt down at one point, and Sheridan was seen in the street drinking while watching the conflagration. A man may surely take a glass of wine by his own fireside, he remarked. His goal had always been a political career, and his wit stood him in good stead when in 1780 he was elected to Parliament. If reports are to be believed, he was one of the greatest orators the House has ever heard. It was a challenging time to be an MP, as the King was said to be losing his mind. In 1788, George III suffered the first bout of his famous madness, and his son, the Prince of Wales, asked Parliament to appoint him regent to rule in his father's stead. The Sheridans were in the Prince of Wales camp, and the connections they had made to his aristocratic supporters saw them in the thick of the action. Their house became the headquarters of the Prince's campaign to take power.
I can barely keep up with this couple. Now they're at the centre of a full-blown constitutional crisis.
Yeah, they're definitely that. And it's because of the fact that George III has become ill, whether we call it madness or he becomes ill with porphyria or it's bipolar, you know, there's all kinds of debates going on. But basically he's ill by November of 1788, and the country is simply riven about what's going to happen.
So they're intimately connected with all of this. Does their investment pay off for them?
No.
Oh.
No, not at all. This beginning of March 1789, the king has recovered. And so nothing of what they've been playing their game for, trying to secure patronage. You know, we'll promise friends this and promise friends that because our people are the Whigs and they're going to be in power. Well, they aren't.
Effectively, they've backed the wrong horse, I guess, in this instance.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
What effect does that have on them?
Well, they've put so much time and energy and money into this, and Sheridan's finances have always been dodgy anyway. They end up with their house being repossessed, but in the slightly longer term, the impact of the cumulative affairs that Sheridan's been having effectively split the couple up. And Elizabeth goes on to have an affair with Lord Edward Fitzgerald and bear his baby. But she's ill, she has consumption, tuberculosis as we would think of it today. By the time that she has the baby, she's very weak, and she only lives a few months afterwards.
Elizabeth was only 37 when she died.
It's such a tragic story and such a sad ending for Elizabeth. Having this backstory really makes me look at the painting in a different way.
Back at Simon's, the results of our various investigations are due. We're waiting to find out if there is any wax present in the paint, and also if Simon has found the solvent forgiving enough to remove the varnish without damaging the original paint layer. If we get the wrong answer to either of these questions, we won't be able to clean the painting, and it'll be much harder to get someone to commit to an attribution. With a good deal of trepidation, I arranged to check in remotely to hear the verdict.
Oh, hello. Wow. How nice to see you again.
Well, let's look at modern technology. How are you?
Very well, yeah.
Have you got any news on our painting? How are all the tests and the analysis?
First of all, the X-ray that came back is absolutely amazing.
The X-ray reveals that the artist had a complete rethink in the process of making the picture. The shadowy outline of the sitter's arms shows that she was originally supporting her head on her left arm.
And it's rather a beautiful composition and fills the rectangle much better, dare I say it, than the one that we've actually got here, which is on top of this.
Simon, all deeply fascinating, but how has our paint analysis gone? Have you got the results yet, and can we clean this picture?
The tests have come back, and there is no wax in the makeup of the painting.
Okay, so this means we can clean it full steam ahead?
Unfortunately not. Bendor, last time we spoke about there being a very hard varnish, which I equated to being like a boat varnish. In order to get that strong boat varnish off, we need something really quite strong solvent to take it off.
When I chose the painting, I thought, obviously it had some superficial issues. It looked like it had been painted with yacht varnish, but I thought that would be quite straightforward to remove.
By using that strong solvent, there is a great danger that it's going to continue through some of the small cracks there and eat away at the original paint surface. So, in short, we cannot do it safely. If you start taking the varnish off, you're going to start taking the paint off as well.
Oh, this is like a hammer blow, a dagger blow to my heart, Simon.
I can't disguise the fact that I'm bitterly disappointed by Simon's news. If we can't clean the painting, the grubby varnish might obscure the details that I hope would confirm it as a Reynolds. After several days scratching my head and scouring the internet, I came across a pioneering outfit based in Madrid who use ultra-high-definition photography and 3D printing to create reproduction artworks. I sent them a photograph of our portrait. A few days later, I had a video call with digital wizard Adam Lowe.
Adam, thank you very much for doing this.
It's a great pleasure.
I've really made a bit of a mess up with choosing a painting that we can't actually restore, so I'm hoping that by some digital magic you're going to be able to help us out here. Is there anything you can do?
As you say, the colour is really quite yellow. I mean, so the varnish has significantly discoloured. We are able to get rid of a lot of the yellow. When we started doing that, that reveals other layers of discoloured varnish that are on the surface of her face appearing a bit like freckles. So we've started on my screen at the moment I'm looking at the first step.
I have no idea how to do that. It looks like I'm in Simon's studio and he's just taken the swab off the face and the varnish has all been removed. It's absolutely extraordinary.
What we're doing is we're just playing with the colour until we can get something that removes the yellow cast. So it's relatively straightforward at this point, except we're in Madrid and the painting's in London. And
it's just extraordinary because I'm in Scotland and my mind is completely blown by what you're able to do. It's just amazing.
The beauty is we should be able to make a physical facsimile to put beside the original. So while I think digital data's magic on screen, seeing it rematerialized without the varnish could be very exciting. I think when you see the two side by side, it should be one of those magical moments to look at it as it was meant to be seen.
That would be tremendously helpful when it comes to showing our Reynolds expert. Oh, I can't wait. Thank you very much.
I'm hoping that this digital solution to our old-fashioned analog problem may just save the day when it comes time to show our portrait to an expert. Though this might be very helpful to our case, I'm always keen to find a comparison which puts the attribution beyond doubt, at least for me personally. I think I've located a picture that does just that. It's a Reynolds self-portrait in a private collection, but I'm happy to say the owner has let us pay a visit.
It's lovely to see this. First of all, because I think it's got great similarities to our picture, not least in the way it's unfinished, and these very broad, sketchy strokes here, allowing the ground layers to come through, yet at the same time giving a hint of the body and the drapery. That's just what we see in our painting. But I'm excited mainly because I think this is not only Reynolds' best self-portrait, but also one of the greatest self-portraits ever made by a British artist. And that's a very bold claim, but let me tell you why. Because it's unfinished, you can see actually in this area here, the paint is still dribbled down the canvas. It's just as Reynolds left it. We see here a pure distillation of what Reynolds can do with paint. This is not something painted for a demanding patron. It's of himself, for himself. It's very private. And that might explain why it's also so experimental. The colours here are just a sort of a really quite bizarre palette of purples and pinks and browns and greys. It could almost have been painted in the 20th century. And you can only get away with painting a portrait like that if you're supremely confident in handling oil paint, as Reynolds was. And because he's so good, just a little turn of the brush here and there can allow him to capture the most extraordinary characterization. It's very subjective, this, but it seems to me that Reynolds here is extremely likable. When this was painted in the mid-1760s, he was absolutely at the height of his powers. People were queuing up to be painted by him. But there's no conceit here. He's presented himself as almost torn between emerging into the fame and the light and yet remaining discreetly in the shadows. It's a portrait I could spend hours staring at. Having seen this, I'm more convinced than ever that Reynolds painted our picture too. It's just so good. And there are so few artists who can paint like this, who can convey the merest shape of drapery with only one or two brushstrokes, and Reynolds is amongst them.
Reynolds would have been in his late 30s when he painted this picture. By this point in his career, he was firmly based in London with a full order book and a very healthy bank balance. On the 3rd of July 1760, he noted in his pocketbook, "House bought." The house in question was number 47 Leicester Square. It was then a very elegant and fashionable address. Difficult to imagine today.
This is a really significant moment in the history of British art. It's in the 18th century that homegrown British artistic talent could win international respect for the first time. And Joshua Reynolds plays a central role in this seismic shift.
The most significant development in winning new respect and international standing for British art was the establishment in 1768 of the Royal Academy of Art in a grand suite of rooms at Somerset House. As well as being an association of the nation's finest artists, it would offer training to promising talent in its own school. The King, George III, was flattered by the idea and happily consented to the royal involvement. It had a unifying effect on the often quarrelsome relations between the artists themselves. Reynolds too was enthusiastic. In this founding group portrait, he's holding the ear trumpet he used in later life. The King can't have been pleased, however, when, at the first meeting of his new institution, his favourites were overlooked, and Joshua Reynolds, for whom the King seemed to feel some personal antipathy, was formally elected its first president.
Much to his chagrin, George found himself obliged to give Reynolds a knighthood as the new president of his Royal Academy.
The rooms that Reynolds knew were later subdivided, but I'm happy to say they're now being restored. The most important space was the Great Room, and we've been given exclusive access before the builders have even left.
Oh, it's lovely.
The impressive roof, letting in the daylight on all four sides, was purpose-built to show off the work of our native painters, who were now gaining international respect for the first time.
It wasn't long before artists from Europe and even America came here to see and be inspired by the very best that British art had to offer.
The Academy's summer exhibition became a fixture on London's society calendar. And here's Sir Joshua with his trademark ear trumpet showing the Prince Regent around. And just look at the hang, not an inch to spare on the walls.
Looking around the room today, it's really quite something to think of all the great British artists who came here to put the finishing touches to their paintings on what they used to call Varnishing Day. All the greats like Constable and Turner and even Reynolds himself.
The Royal Academy was a huge success, in large part thanks to its first president, and Reynolds used his prestigious new position to promote his own style, the grand manner. But by focusing on his swagger portraits, it's easy to overlook that some of his greatest pictures were of women. This is Reynolds' portrait of the writer and aesthete Horace Walpole, who claimed Mr. Reynolds seldom succeeds with women. I can't agree. In Georgian Britain, women were considered the property of the men in their lives, and to have any sort of identity outside of the control of their families was seen as scandalous, something that is so well illustrated by Elizabeth's extraordinary story. Fortunately, however, there were plenty of women who were willing to endure the disapproval of society. And one of the things I like so much about Reynolds' work is that he seems to be drawn to precisely these type of women. This is the actress Kitty Fisher in the guise of Cleopatra, showing her about to dissolve a pearl in her wine. The circle made by her fingers holding the pearl was intended to suggest the power of her sexuality. Tantalizingly, there is another Reynolds portrait of Elizabeth Linley. It's part of the collection of Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild and still hangs in the house he built on a hillside in Buckinghamshire, Waddesdon Manor. Baron Ferdinand had a thing for Reynolds and his portraits of women in particular. This is our heroine, Elizabeth Linley, in the guise of Saint Cecilia, the patron saint of music. Reynolds himself called it the best picture I have ever painted.
Certainly they look quite different, but I think the neck and the ear are the same, and there's the same structural eyebrow. I think the main differences are the nose and the strength of the jawline.
I'd say the jury's out. Interestingly, we know Reynolds did use wax to paint this picture, and we can see the damage this caused, with areas of cracking, leaving a kind of alligator skin surface. There's another portrait I wanted to have a look at in the Baron's collection, showing Reynolds pulling out all of the stops to demonstrate what he was capable of. This is Anne, Duchess of Cumberland, who married George III's younger brother. The king did not approve. She had been born a commoner, was a divorcee, and had a risque reputation. He passed a law requiring members of the royal family to get his permission to wed in future.
I think this picture proves that Horace Walpole was wrong. Reynolds could succeed with women. And Walpole basically admits his mistake, saying of this portrait that the Duchess has the most amorous eyes, with eyelashes a yard long.
He also said she was difficult to resist.
Painting makes her seem so tall and regal, and that's accentuated by the column running behind her and the way her hair is piled onto her head. She's clearly looking down at us, but her pose stops the gaze from feeling haughty.
I'm suddenly struck by something else about her pose. Now that we've seen the arms in the X-ray of the Glasgow portrait, there are strong similarities to this painting. If you were to switch the column to her left side and view the Duchess in profile, you'd have a pretty close match. And my goodness, is that a retroussé nose? I'm thinking back to the letter from the Marquis of Dufferin and Ava in the Glasgow Museum files. Could he have been right all these years?
At Simon's studio, the portrait is scanned to record the surface of the picture in minute detail. Back in Madrid, the data is used to make a three-dimensional base, which replicates every contour of the original. The digitally cleaned image of the painting is then printed onto the ground layer to produce an exact 3D version of the original portrait. The finishing touch is a coat of old-fashioned varnish. A few weeks later, the facsimile arrives in London, where Simon and I unwrap it in excited anticipation.
Look at that. What wizardry is this? Look at the surface of it. It's absolutely, look at the texture. It really looks like a panel.
You've got all the grain of the wood coming through, haven't you?
I have to say, I am super impressed. Look at the colours. Should we stick it next to the real thing?
Yeah.
Amazing to have them side by side. I hate to say this, Simon, you might be out of a job here.
I think I'm going to be out of a job. I mean, it's remarkable, isn't it?
And we don't need to worry about any of your swabs and varnishes and waxy layers anymore. It's just touch of a button.
It's there for life, isn't it?
The contrast between the two pictures is stunning. The freshness of the digitally cleaned facsimile has given the picture a new brilliance. It's time to get the verdict on who painted this portrait. And we've invited 18th century painting expert and Reynolds biographer Martin Postle to give us his opinion. We've decided to start by showing him the original painting on its own.
Interesting. Profile's unusual. Not many profiles by Reynolds.
One single piece of mahogany.
Mahogany, yeah. Indeed, very unusual for Reynolds.
Oh dear, two problems straight away. I'd already briefed Martin on the picture's indestructible coat of yellow varnish, so I felt this was the moment to play our trump card.
Martin, we've had a reproduction made, which could give you a little bit of an idea as to what the original colours look like.
Right. Goodness me. This is an artificial painting, isn't it?
Completely artificial.
This is not painted by a human being.
I have to say, it looks pretty impressive. What do you think?
I think you can say with some confidence that if Simon had been allowed to get his paws on it, it would look closer to that.
Do you feel confident about giving us some form of attribution?
Everything I would expect to find in a painting by Joshua Reynolds is here. I don't have any qualms about it. Handling, that very characteristic broad strokes, and the layers, the depth that Reynolds has in this portrait. There's all sorts of... Yeah, the thickness. Everything broadly handled here, just touched it in. Reynolds is very direct when he paints. He paints straight onto the surface, whether it's a canvas or a panel. There's not a lot of underpainting going on. He just goes for it. And this has that kind of excitement. She's not classically beautiful, but there is a kind of attractiveness, there's a warmth to it.
It's a great relief to have the attribution so confidently confirmed. But I was interested to hear Martin's opinion on whether the portrait does show Elizabeth Linley.
It's not Elizabeth Linley. Elizabeth Linley actually is more classically beautiful. And if you look at the portrait at Waddesdon, where she's St. Cecilia and she's playing the organ, she has a almost kind of classical profile, a straight nose. This lady doesn't. She looks rather different. Who could it be? My guess, or maybe informed opinion, is that I think it's Anne, Duchess of Cumberland, who Reynolds painted in a big full-length portrait. That's a picture that's at Waddesdon. I think this is the same sitter. Her physiognomy is similar, her coiffure is similar, and actually the dress is quite similar. And the eyelashes. We all know that she had very long eyelashes and she was quite cheeky and a little bit scandalous. And she's the sort of woman that Reynolds would have wanted to have painted.
Right.
And she was, even though she was a duchess, she was kind of in that league.
Right.
She was rather disreputable.
So, Martin, on its return to Glasgow, what is going to be on the label?
I think it should say Sir Joshua Reynolds. I wouldn't say attributed to Joshua Reynolds. I would say Joshua Reynolds.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Lovely. Yeah.
Well, that's marvellous, Martin. I can't thank you enough. Really great.
Well, it's great. Yeah.
I'm super pleased to have my hunch about the identity of our sitter supported by Martin. We now have a great story to report back to Glasgow museums. We set up at Kelvin Grove Gallery, home to the portrait of Archibald McLellan, the man who may have been misled when he bought a picture of Elizabeth Linley. The picture has been reunited with its fine original frame, which the Resource Centre conservators have restored beautifully. We've also brought along a little present in the form of the facsimile. A group of museum staff gathered to hear what we had discovered about their painting.
Hello, thank you very much for coming, everybody. We started this programme about a year and a half ago. The dreaded COVID got in the way, but finally we have finished, and it's very nice to see you all here today.
First, the good news.
We assembled all our evidence, and we summoned up the courage to show this to Martin Postle. And I'm very pleased to be able to tell you that he is absolutely certain this is, in fact, by Sir Joshua Reynolds. The news on the sitter is Martin is absolutely convinced it is not Elizabeth Linley. So that's that attractive story in the dustbin, unfortunately. Martin instead is fairly sure that the sitter is Anne, Duchess of Cumberland. And ladies and gentlemen, the story does not end there, because we were so frustrated at not being able to reveal what this picture looked like originally underneath, that we'd done something we've never done before, and we had a facsimile made. So I hope you like it. Are you ready? Please come and look a little bit closer, see if you can tell the difference.
We're delighted that the painting has been shown to be by Sir Joshua Reynolds. We've learnt so much about Reynolds' artistic practice along the way. It's brilliant to have the facsimile too, so we can see what the painting might have looked like if we'd been able to clean it.
As one of the most popular British painters, it's no surprise to find that there are over 600 pictures by Joshua Reynolds in British collections. But as with our portrait, many of the attributions are uncertain.
Why not use the map feature on Art UK and look for a lost masterpiece near you?